Yeah.
This has to be public.
Oh, okay.
Are we expecting others?
Doreen is coming a little bit late. She's grabbing some food. Damaris cannot attend, and Sylvia can't attend. So it's just us. Intimate setting.
More talking
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Jeremy's calling their time.
By me, right?
I even brought lobby.
Thank you.
Patrick.
So I guess we're gonna look into just a little bit of the structure and nature of reserves and how we use them, just so we understand a little bit what goes on. Is that sort of a part of the budget that's hard to parse? Where can we start that discussion from?
So, I did include it this evening in part of the presentation material. I mean, we can go right
Oh,
to it.
it's in our emails, right?
Yep,
Okay.
yep, and I have it there live this evening.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see it.
I mean, if you want us just to jump in, we can,
Yeah.
should we?
Yes.
You want me to jump, you jump?
You start.
Okay.
You're on a roll.
Sorry, I didn't see it behind me, so.
Yes, so I think this evening, we did put a few slides together based upon some of the feedback we received at the last meeting, as you just mentioned, to speak a little bit more in depth about reserves, which we had done at a finance committee meeting, but we felt it's important for the entire board to have that conversation as we consider the right level of reserves that is currently being recommended to fund next year 23-24 budget. So as part of the deck tonight, we do have where our current reserves sit. I gave a little bit of definition just for the record, because this will be sitting on our website, just in terms of what the definition of each of these reserves, why it's established, what it's for. I can then speak to, how much we currently have, why there may be recommendations for it to be funded at a certain amount of dollars in one year, where at times where you'll see it going down is because the idea is like that we won't have to have that reserve because we won't have that liability. So, and we're also I also included some of the transportation information that was previously discussed at finance. So we can kind of just start running through the slides, if that's okay?
Yeah,
And then I think the idea of, I guess, this evening is beyond that. It's just an ability to kind of, either if there's other information that we've discussed previously that we want to focus in, or just generally let the board discuss and ask questions about the budget. So this, tonight, again, just to remind us where we are, calendar, I don't think I need to walk through it, but just tells you where we are in our current budget process. And the date for the board to adopt the budget is quickly approaching us next week. And this is just an overview of the areas tonight that we put together to kind of briefly go over prior to the board beginning their discussion. Again, the reminder of where we currently sit, and I do reference the 323 board meeting. This was the latest and greatest of the numbers that we presented. The first number, I keep thinking I want to move that number, but that really doesn't represent where we are. It's just representing what our legal levy cap growth was for this year, which is 4.03. Our current tax levy proposal that is included in this expenditure plan is 2.83%, so it's less than the allowable 4% number. But the budget to budget change is 4.19%. We've spoken about this in the past, but there are some unique one-time or specific expenditures that made our budget to budget a bit higher than we originally had presented to the board. And they're noted on this slide. And again, one of them, just as a reminder, the governor, the legislature currently has not agreed to the state budget.
Right.
It's typically due on April 1st. It's typically approved by April 1st. The governor has extended the deadline twice. It was extended to this week till today, till yesterday, excuse me, and they did do another motion to move that date to the 17th, and that's only because if they don't approve the budget, then technically the state they're not allowed to pay payrolls for their employees. So currently, the one-time high-impact tutoring allocation that is a requirement of the increase in foundation aid is still included, and it is something that was a priority for the district anyway. So I think that even if that were to, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but even if that requirement were to go away, I believe that this $170,000 recommendation would stand in our budget. And again, go ahead.
Very quick
Sorry.
question.
Yep.
Kirsten, I haven't asked it. The high-impact tutoring, is that across the buildings, or is that set somewhere?
So we were thinking about it as a math interventionist at the middle school because we don't currently have that. So in the past, there was a position that was partial coach, partial interventionist, but in terms of biggest bang for the buck, to have one or the other, but not to have the split role, allows the person to pick people up through the multi-tiered system of support referral process. And if an intervention rises to the level of needing additional support, that would be that position, a math interventionist. Currently, we do have that at the elementary school. Right now, it's the position that Jada Dickens is in. And what we're seeing is, in terms of students, we want them in, we want them getting interventions on a cycle, and then we want them out. But that would be the equivalent of what that's talking about.
Thank you.
Again, so our budget-to-budget growth without those two numbers, but again, it would be 3.28, but the reality is our budget-to-budget is 4.19, so.
So when you write the growth without the transfer to capital, is that just us expending 500,000 on the capital expenditure? It says transfer, are we transferring it from reserves to pay for that?
No, it's just it's the term of how, no, so it's just a capital.
It's an expense,
It's
not
an
really
expense,
a
yeah, but the
It's called
term,
the
it is
transfer?
called an interfund transfer, but it is part of our expenditure budget. But it would be, so just don't worry about the word transfer. It is
Right.
a capital.
If we weren't spending 500,000.
It would be
on-
3.28.
Right, so
Yep.
we are spending it, and that's on the water drainage issue?
No, this is for the proposed classrooms here for the life skills classrooms that we've been
Gotcha.
discussing. So, and we'll speak a little bit
And
more
then
about that.
It's
Yes,
not really
sure.
a one-time, isn't it, 2 years? Didn't we hear
Well-
last meeting that they expect it to be 500,000
Yeah, but
this year and another 500,000 next year?
Sure,
Or is
so
that
I-
for staff, not really the
Well,
build-out?
So I think the bill is going to, so part of the reason the build-outs will be likely a little bit more than 500,000 is because as we build out those classrooms, other people will then have to be put where. Although that, I did mention as the budget number, as Joe and I, working with the architects, and we had a facilities meeting prior to this, I think there's some discussion around what does that final number look like. Some of it is related to that transfer, but to answer your question, there are different ways we could decide to fund that additional work if needed, whether it be, we do another transfer, or whether it be, do we consider using the capital reserve? So that's why, at the time of creating this slide, it was a one-time, but to your point, that it could be something we want to consider transferring, making higher, or budgeting higher level capital expenditures in our budget for future years.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, yep.
Yeah.
Again, just as part of the record, these are the major drivers. We've spoken about them at length.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
I know I was late, maybe you covered this
Yeah.
already. I know we were just talking about the budget not getting passed. Do I have to talk into the mic? If the budget doesn't get passed, does that mean we don't get the money from the state?
No, we would, we would still get the money. I think the high-impact tutoring was, if the budget went down, let's just play this out. If the budget went down, the high-impact tutoring, unless there's a change in how the foundation aid has to be spent, if we came out with another budget, we would still include that in however spending plan we were going to do. We would always get our state aid. There's no risk in that. But if currently the proposal from the governor includes a certain percentage of the monies you're receiving to be spent in a very,
We'd still get that allotment, but it would
but if we didn't spend it on
wouldn't
that,
be
then technically
specified.
they could take monies away. I would imagine that's, I think when, although it's in the grand scheme of things that the monies we're receiving, it's not a huge amount of it, but it is a requirement, so I think we would have to do it. I don't know if there's something, I don't think anyone considers not doing it if it's a requirement.
So are you asking, though, that if the governor's budget goes down or this aspect
Oh,
gets
sorry.
removed, would we still get money for this? Well, I think the answer is we'd still get our foundation aid level, which would be the same. We just would have more flexibility unless we'd want to spend on this anyway.
Got
Oh,
it.
okay, oh, sorry.
Right, is that what?
Oh, I guess,
That's-
You were asking if the
yeah.
state budget went down, not the Hastings budget.
State budget.
oh, I'm sorry, that's what I was
No,
misunderstanding.
Oh, sorry.
I read it your way as well.
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was
I meant-
focusing on our budget. going
Sorry, I
down.
wasn't clear. I meant the state budget.
Okay,
yeah.
so if the
Our budget's not going down,
Ours-
Maureen. I
the
wasn't
state
worried
budget-
about
The
that.
state budget doesn't go down, it just gets kind of agreed to. I think what's currently occurring is that, I think the dollars, I don't want to not be completely off here, I think the dollars that we're seeing that we should be expecting, I don't anticipate those going down. There's just other things that they're grappling with. If anything, I think the legislators may be trying to get more money.
Their proposal is significantly
Yes,
larger.
significant, and then there's other things in the governor's proposal that are outside of the funding, that are all the other kind of items that have to be also agreed to. So, but I believe that our state funding that we are currently building into our budget, we will receive next year at least.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. A reminder, I think everyone is very familiar with what our current budget includes in terms of new positions. And, you know, if there's questions later or even now related to anything that's on these slides, we can discuss it further. But just as a reminder, you know, these are all being driven, well, the first two by special education needs at Hillside. One is to establish an additional ICT class that is, the current numbers are such that they believe there needs to be another section at second grade next year. And then the other position is for the communications class, which has historically run at Hillside. This year, we didn't have students that would have been the age of that particular class, but we will have students that will need to be in that program next year, so that's where you see those first two positions
What's a
being-
communications class?
So
Sorry.
that is a class, it's a, Melissa, I mean, it's an 811, safety.
Yeah, self-contained special education class. And so it's entirely for students with disabilities, and there are specific ratios on the individualized education plans that have to be met by the district.
Got it. So
And-
it looks like then all of our increases in staff are for special ed.
Well,
Is that correct?
Hillside, well, except for the third one, well, math interventionist is not necessarily for
Except for math,
special ed.
sorry, I don't, yeah, not math
And the
interventionists.
additional 1.0 FTE at Hillside is for, is being recommended based upon keeping our enrollment, the number of students in each grade
Got
level.
it. So that's not the ICT
No, it's
teacher.
not. It's
Okay.
just
There's
an
at least
additional.
2 full FTEs that
Yeah.
would be.
And plus the teacher
And then the
assistant.
assistant teacher.
Yes,
Got
yep.
it, okay.
And we
Sorry.
could go back. I mean, we continue, we haven't mentioned it, but I think it's clear to a lot of us. There's another staff member that we're taking on. I mean, our DEI
Yes.
position was funded by a 2-year grant. And we put up a lot of stuff in the $100,000 range. For some reason, we're not talking about it or putting it up at all.
Oh, can
I'm assuming this is the year.
I just address that?
Yeah, I'm assuming this is the year that we, the administrators, are choosing to put that into the budget, and it'll be the first time we're funding it at a 1.0. In what ways would I be wrong on that?
So you're not wrong in what you first said, but an update to what you said, actually. So we never fully funded the position, we already had a 0.6 always in our
Yeah.
budget. We were funding the additional 0.4 through the grant. What's the name of that one, that grant?
It was the, I want to say, ARP.
ARP, yeah, sorry. There's so many like acronyms that right now I couldn't pull it out. So the ARP grant. So when we had put the grant together, based upon the budget numbers for both that position as well as the others, where we currently are is we have about 35,000 or so that we're able to kind of almost take it over 3 years is because we had other dollars in there that were a little bit, we didn't spend as much on one thing. So when we were discussing the budget this year, to your earlier point, we did say, okay, we had it on the list. You know, if we were going to continue with this, we have to add these amount of dollars that were previously, but as Melissa and I, we have to update and report out on the grants each year based on actual expenditures. What we were noticing in that grant actually was a 3-year grant, actually, like in
Weird.
total, we actually had the money to cover it for next year.
For next year as
yes.
well.
So then that discussion would then be discussed as we discuss the 24-25 budget. So yeah.
That's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
So I don't, you got it.
Yeah, I hope it was clear. So
I got it, he got it.
Okay, good. Thank you. And that'll happen, so when we when we plan for grant-funded things, sometimes there are some tweaks in either an area where we had dedicated a little bit of money, but but being that it was part of what we proposed to use the money for, we're still okay. Like, it wasn't something we're like, oh, we'll just use the extra money for something random.
No,
That
it's
wasn't
very
approved.
okay.
So it was really tight, and it was for that same purpose, so we were allowed to then pay for it next year.
Thank you.
Welcome. And again, the remainder, driven on enrollment, when you have additional sections at buildings, occasionally you'll have to increase the special, and you'll see that there with the art. Some additional options for students in terms of STEAM, low ticket and money, but big bang for your buck there. And again, the capital transfer we mentioned here again, and we'll talk about that in greater detail as we discuss the life skills classes later this evening.
Wait, is that for the life skill, wasn't the life skill class 500?
Well,
This says
it's about
550?
I mean, there's five, it's range. We have about 570 currently in the budget, I think it's 570 in the budget proposal in total. I think as we're just trying to finalize the plan, as Jeremy had mentioned, it may be a little bit more, not so much as just for those classrooms, but as you displace others, there'll be a need to renovate some of the other spaces. So there's 550 in that line item in total, with the hopes that a few other maintenance items could be also addressed in that. But I think it allows us the flexibility as we finalize, because again, it's based upon a budgeted number for that, work, so.
Yeah, I thought we heard at the meeting from one of, our top special ed, presenters, that they referred to it as like a $1 million build-out, a 2-year $1 million build-out.
Yeah.
So it sounded like, from their point of view, it was more of a, can't do everything right away. And it wasn't clear whether, we don't need staff for this. We have the staff ready to run that room?
Yeah,
Or is
so-
that year 3 when we would hire people for that?
It looks as though, so I think currently, my understanding, there is a teacher currently in the middle school who teaches a life skills class. I think, my understanding, and I don't want to misspeak, but I think you would have him and possibly, I mean, even though it's kind of a full-day program, I think there would likely, if anything, be like a slight increase, but it looked to me on paper that there would not be a staffing increase, because if the students need shift, likely another special ed teacher at the high school that, it could be. But I think, again, it really depends on the enrollments across the board this year. So I think maybe if it was happening this year, they may have been able to do it without a large increase in staffing, but it's really going to be based on the year as well and what the other needs. Is that fair, Melissa?
It would actually also depend on Committee on Special Education determinations on, students and what their needs are. And so there is a little bit of variability, like there would be 10 years just in terms of classification if somebody needs additional hours, if we have to run another co-taught section. So it's hard to predict for sure, and it is quite possible that we might need a little bit extra in terms of delivery.
And I want to, again, speak to the build-out, because I think it will be likely more than 500,000, not for those rooms in particular, but some of the other rooms that will be addressed in this total renovation will also, because there's demo to some of the existing locker rooms that are dead space and things like that. So although the total may be closer to $1 million possibly, that's also if we end up reconstructing some of these other rooms to, enhance other areas also. So it is true, because it's kind of part of a larger project, but with that 500,000 or 550, depending on what the final number is, because again, this is, based on the cost of some of the construction that'll be external. We'll do a lot of the work internally, but some of those HVAC and asbestos numbers, we don't have the exact dollar amount on. We feel that all that work for those 2 classrooms can be done. It's really for the restoration of some of the other spaces that will need some extra money. And we're hoping that, possibly if the HVAC's not as extensive as it may need to be, maybe a little less. But I think doing construction schools is expensive, so I think, it's at least 550 to get the classrooms opened up. There may be some additional capital spending based upon the restoration of some of the other spaces.
And are we anticipating saving money because some
Yeah.
people who are going out of
Yes.
district will be able to come back into district
Yeah,
because we have this?
I think the idea, did you want, were you signal? Oh, sorry. The idea is, yes, I think there's twofold. I mean, first, in the special ed, of course, they should always be looking through this lens. They're always looking at what's best for the students that they're overseeing. I don't know if that's the right word, but, working within the families. I think the idea that it's always best to have programs in district, and then there is the side of it, even I'll use the communications class that's currently exists at Hillside, because I think that's a good example where we did an investment in the facility, of course, to build out classrooms for those programs, because they're different size than a typical classroom, and they require some other rooms, like sensory rooms and things such as that in the building for those students. But there's, in terms of money, there are savings because we're able to run the program less expensive than it may have been if we would have sent these students out, because that is true. And then in addition to that, we do, again, you can't make a capital investment based on this because it may not happen, but at the case of the communications classes at Hillside, we've typically had minimally 2 students from other districts who come and pay us tuition to be in that program, because most schools, it's a allowable 8:1 ratio, but typically most schools will run things with 4 of their own students, as we do. So we always have room to take on tuition students. So that being said, and we don't want to build it for that, but we have over the years received a good amount of tuition from other districts so it has kind of offset any capital investment that we made in establishing those classrooms at Hillside. There is also the bus routes, although our in-district students who attend that may need specialized busing at Hillside, we still have to pay a different charge for that bus. But what you're able to do is use one bus to transport 3 students, because you can go drive one, come back, so it is more efficient on the transportation end too. Again, I don't know if any of these students would even require transportation at the middle high level. Some of their parents, as some of the students who are currently in those programs are transported by their parents, not all, but that may also, I think a parent is more likely to transport their child here than to go to Sleepy Hollow, I don't know, or wherever another program may be, or Rockland actually. So I think that you could consider that there would be a significant, or a potential savings of transportation. I don't want to say significant, but I think that is likely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. District more reserves. Okay, so again, this was just a reminder, none of this is new, but just give some bulleted items on what other they're not proposals, but this budget incorporates a step down of some use of appropriated fund balance and retirement reserve, and by doing so allows us at the end of the year to be in a little bit better condition with our reserves to potentially offset our concerns around state aid funding. Budget overview, we've gone over this, and again, I don't want to monopolize the time, so you'll have plenty of time to talk and ask questions. So that's just the exact numbers we've looked at before. Again, I keep talking this transfer. So, this is probably where you see the extra 500,000 in there. And this is really, as it states here, it depends on where we go with the final plan about the renovation of the locker rooms. And that's why sometimes it's hard to parse out just looking at the life skills classes, because in a building where you don't have a lot of dead, empty, unoccupied space, anything we touch will then need to be moved. So when we talk about, and we discussed this earlier at our facilities committee meeting, and we are planning on having a much more comprehensive 5-year overview of facilities planning, which will highlight both programmatic and other kind of maintenance type items in the building. But where we've currently identified those classes to be located, it will require some additional construction over the next couple of years. So that's why I put that bullet on there, just to kind of make sure that people understand that although there's an initial cost to get the classrooms open, there could be some additional dollars. And these are kind of high. I'd rather go high than cut them too low, because I don't ever want to do that.
What does that mean? Oh, sorry, Alex.
Go ahead.
What does that mean, modification to girls' locker room and bathrooms?
So where the 2 currently, and this was again discussed at length, and it changed a number of times, of where if we were able to bring the life skills classes to this complex, where they would be located. And part of, and I was discussing this at the facility, and I'll give you the connection to the locker room. Because the idea is to create a middle school and a high school life skills class that has a shared middle component, and that really allows for those classrooms to also be used for regular classroom space, right? So there's one kitchen, one, so the way the program runs, those elements don't need to be used the entire day. So the thinking was, and this was with special ed and the building principal leadership, along with the architects, really discussed this idea of having some, that they would be sitting next to each other. Now, as we look at the building, we typically don't like to have high school students in the middle school, like in an area of the building that's purely middle school and vice versa. So every time they considered these classrooms, they looked at spaces that are currently, that hallway is used currently by middle school and high school students, which there was maybe one or two other options that would have even possibly been more costly or required a lot more movement of people, because both these classrooms too need to be a certain amount of square, they're like rather large classrooms. They're not like a tight classroom, so it did require like a big chunk of space. So it was finally decided that the most feasible place for them to exist are down where between the Cochran gym and the Green gym. And currently, there's a lot of dead space in some of our locker rooms that are like old abandoned showers and bathrooms, and as well as TV studio and different things that would then be, that space was identified as being like reconfigured, but that would also then require some other modifications to, like, as we're taking space from one, we would have to like either shift out in the other direction. So we would be doing it in stages, like we may have to displace a classroom for the year and then maybe then use another space, which we have kind of a long-term plan that, okay, then maybe this room gets reconfigured to something else. So it's kind of a tiered plan, but I think.
I just want to make sure that the girls aren't losing out.
No, actually, this is actually tied to a plan of getting the girls a better locker room.
Perfect.
Yeah, so it's actually has, like, that's why I said it's money for this, but then we're also gaining in other ways, so.
Yeah, that's been kind of dead space
Yeah.
for a while.
Yeah,
there,
the
so.
girls' locker room, that was part of our last bond proposal, and with the boys, so there's a lot of dead space on both sides, and the idea is that the girls would get a better space than they currently have. More equal to what the boys have.
Excellent.
So, yeah, so that's kind of part of that phase two, which is kind of baked into this reno, but it's also some of that money will then enhance other programs.
Great, thank you.
So it's hard to kind of pull it out. Okay. Revenue. Again, if you can read this on the screen, you have great eyesight. But so this is our revenue. We can, as the board, they do have this that you may be able to see better on your screen. So if you have any questions in regards to any revenue line, even later on, you can ask if you want to go back to those. Again, not going to go over this again. I think one of the things this year, once the board adopts the budget, we'll be putting our budget book out with, we've kind of beefed up some of the detail this year in it. And one of the things that I haven't yet done, but just kind of put a glossary in the back, just so like the terms like tax cap, tax levy, all the things here that are maybe it'll help people be a little bit easier to navigate our budget book. So, we'll be giving an example of that, and then also putting some definitions with it. Again, this is just something that all districts, probably it's not just unique to New York, but it's just always a challenge, and revenue is always a challenge for us, and especially here where the majority of it does come from the taxpayers, and what we get from New York State, there's always a little bit of a concern whether they'll be able to keep up the current level. We've spoken about this before, that the controller of New York, who gives an independent opinion of the state's budget, because that's how it's set up and it should be. He, is currently just, a little, well, not a little, he stated some concerns in regards to that, currently the level of funding that the state will receive from the federal government will not continue, and they're also looking, I think the Wall Street bonuses were down, and things like that that do have impact on the state's budget. So I think we're always cautious here when we think about that revenue.
Do we, the Graham School was supposed to be turned into a studio.
Yes.
Is that going to impact our budget next year,
Well,
the tax money?
so I think, and I think if it does go through, my guess, I'm just saying if it were to be approved, I think that's probably more like a two-year before we would see anything, and I guess it depends upon,
2 years out.
yeah, I would say about 2 years, that would
Okay.
be a safe. So I guess there could be a potential, like, as we think about the even if it came on like later in the school year, like whatever comes on, we'll receive some money that year, it would be likely 2 years now from now. But I think that's, yeah, that would be great. Reserves.
I think, maybe, Alex, you might want to speak to this. I mean, I think it's an incredible opportunity for Hastings to develop a revenue source and maximize the space in a way that minimizes disruption. And there's a lot of hard work to have it be minimally disruptive, in be it traffic or other things. So it's I think, a real plus, and it helps the taxpayers of this village to have that type of revenue source.
Yeah, I mean, one
don't
of
know
the,
if you want to add to it.
no, one of the big
Get more
aspects,
in a live meeting, I think it helps to
no,
make a point here.
one of the, I mean, just on the back of an envelope, it's what you would draw up. You have tax revenue coming in, and you don't have students that come from it. So that's, that would sort of be the best requirement that we could have. But the other thing which you brought up when we talked about it, people have to realize because it was a school space, it didn't contribute anything to our budget. So it's a sort of double step up, you
Right.
know.
Like anything there would have been a step
Yeah.
up, to be honest with you. I mean, because
Yeah.
any school, church, or tax exempt organization, and that's something that it's always in our budget book, but if you ever, this year, when you kind of look at it, there's an exemption disclosure, and actually there's, quite a few, there's a good amount of tax exempt properties in Hastings.
Yeah.
So,
And again, the earlier proposal for that was for 200 residential units without any commercial component at all. So it's a very good proposal. current
yes,
one.
I mean, it's, if you, right, better than others. Okay, and again, I just put here, and this is for the record, a definition of reserves, and this is not my definition, it's the state's definition, so I just included it here just to kind of explain how reserves are typically funded. Again, this is not unique to Hastings, this is every district, that's how reserves are funded, and that's where the money's, how they get in there, and how you're legally allowed to establish them. There's another, and we're going to be talking about a little bit about that this evening, as I just again remind the board of the reserves the district currently has established, and there are a few others. We have quite a few of them, but we don't have them all. But the ones that we need, we do have. So, just again, this is just a snapshot of a historical snapshot of where our reserves and our fund balances. So reserves are, as it was in the earlier slide, they're basically like a savings account. I like to liken it to that. But they have to be established for a very specific purpose, and it's under the law, and it's not something we can say, well, we think we may have liabilities here or there. There's a really definite way you need to establish each of these, and I've provided a description, so as we speak about each of them, you can understand why we have it, why it's currently funded at where it is, and why we may need to consider having more in there or potentially less. So just because you have reserves, there's times, and I'm just going to kind of really briefly go through where, the current June 2022 reflects where our current, at the end of our last fiscal year, with the assigned and restricted parts of our fund balance, we're about $11 million, or $11.5 million. That number includes monies that were designated this year for either to balance our budget or for encumbrances that may have already been spent. So you have your end balance, and then you have kind of like what happens during the course of the year. But currently, and I'll go through each line item, we're anticipating to end our final fund balance at a little bit less, a little bit step down of what our total fund balance was last year, but it's still at about $11 million. And just kind of going through each of the line items, and I'm going to do that here, I believe, because I think it may be the easiest because the dollars are there. So currently we have a tax certiorari reserve, and a tax certiorari is a reserve that is established to allow districts to reserve funds needed to pay tax certiorari claims that are filed against the district, and they are for non-homestead properties. So a lot of people don't know what that, well, non-homestead is, when people file an individual, like you as a homeowner, if you filed a SCAR, a petition to have your taxes reduced, that has to be settled within a year of you filing it. And that, what happens is we don't pay the homeowners back. It just naturally, either your taxes get reduced in that year that you filed. But this is really for any businesses, but they do also include all of the co-ops and condos in town. So although they really are, by definition, you would think of them as homestead, meaning, you know, people's homes. Under the law, or under the town of Greenberg, they don't consider them homestead. You could be a homestead in a condo and co-op, but for us, a lot of our tax certiorari's, and this is why I bring this up, come from some of those properties. We've had, we have current liabilities with a lot of the co-ops and condos in the village, are some of our larger liabilities that we currently are facing.
And if I'm not incorrect, they have like a look back when they.
Yeah,
they
so
can-
unlike
Right.
a residential homeowner that you file, it has to be settled within 12 months of your claim, or not settled if they don't think your assessment is wrong. We have some tax certiorari claims for like one individual property that can date back 6, 7, 8, 10 years. And when you finally, when it's finally settled, yes, it then can go back. One of the things that does happen, everyone who files, and it's similar to SCARs, because I see those applications too, most of the time people will like, it'll be a significant, they're looking for a significant reduction that typically gets settled a little bit, more in the middle of what they're requesting. But currently, we have about $12 million of unsettled claims. Now, that being said, most of the claims will settle about 40% of exposure. Sometimes, some may be a little higher, some will be a little bit less, we may not pay anything at all, quite frankly. But that being said, that's over a long period of time. And that, to your point, there could be things that could take many years. There are things that sometimes drop off or don't get settled. So although that number looks like a big number, I would never suggest that we have like a $6 million tax cert reserve. I think as we look at it, we always want to make sure we can kind of pay our at least our next 4 to 5 years of claims, if not more. And then looking to replenish it, of course, because I think we're never going to pay like even if we had to pay the $12 million out, it would be over the course of like 10 years. So I think looking at that, and it would never be the 12 million, I think you don't want to over reserve there either. I think it's an area where if we had some extra funds some years, we are allowed to reserve for what we believe or close to that outstanding liability amount. But currently where we're seeing is we have about 1.5 in there. Years ago, there were different years. If we go back to the 2017, as an example, you'll see we had 2.3 million at the end of that fiscal year, and the end of the fiscal year, June 30th, 2018, we did pay out a 1.1 million settlement. And I believe that was for Clairwood at that. I think it was the big chunk of that settlement was paid to them.
And talking about like specific properties, would that be inappropriate in a public meeting? Or, do we have any claims still with Clairwood, or is Clairwood settled and no longer?
I have to look at them. What typically
Or how many
happens?
different, co-op or condo units currently, or we have a liability claim?
We have quite a bit.
Yeah, and they,
It's a big chunk of our liabilities for condo.
And how many different units? The units on Broadway before we get to the Andrus home?
Yes.
The units on Broadway after we get
Yes.
to Andrus home?
Yeah.
Any of our apartment buildings in town,
Yes.
the Maple Street?
Right, and
They're all asking, or they've all already filed.
We've played a lot of claims over the years, but what happens with those type of properties, are that, again, there's a couple times you could take a bite at the apple and then you're gonna be done. Like, there will be no, I think, we've had a couple settlements with some of them already, so the likelihood, or even if they refile, the exposure's much less, right? Because as you settle them, and I mean, in fairness, they were over-assessed. I mean, that's the reality. Like, nobody wants to pay more than they should. So based upon the formula to calculate co-op and condos, it's very different than a residential home. Because it's based upon their rental value, not their actual sale
Right.
value.
Right, I wouldn't agree with, in fairness, they were overassessed, though. You
Well,
have
I guess
people
based
buy-
upon, but
They
based
buy
upon,
$1
but I'm saying
million,
based on the law,
they
town
buy
of
$1
Greenberg
million
is-
home, and then they claim that they should be assessed as if it's a rental property, and that's based on the law.
Well, that's what
which
I'm saying,
was-
based on
yeah,
the law,
Based
right.
on the law, they don't have to pay taxes
Correct.
on the value of their
Right.
homes,
They paid on, based on the rental value.
even though these aren't rental properties.
Correct.
So how many different, how many different units do we have like that in Hastings?
I can bring that back, I don't have the numbers in front of me, I
'Cause it
know we
seems
looked
that
at it.
If it's 12, I mean, is this all within the
No, it's not-
last 10 years
Well,
that
it's
these
not,
have all
just to be clear,
filed?
this
'Cause
is not all non-home, this is not all co-ops and condos, this is also like the A and P
Commercial,
when it was,
yeah.
it was before
Some
like,
commercial ones.
yeah.
But if it usually gets settled in about 8 years.
yeah.
So
Some
most
come
of these
closer.
have to have been within the last 10 years, because we would settle. So it seems like we
Yeah.
have about, like what you said, 40%, so maybe $5 million worth of liability
Yeah.
that would be paid out a little bit each year. We wouldn't have to pay it out immediately when
Mm-hmm. Right.
it settles.
Right.
And then do those types of condo co-ops file again?
Occasionally, but I've seen it.
It could be
ha-
that within 10 years, we have no real,
Correct. I think the idea is when they did the reassessment in Hastings, which, what we were told when the town of Greenberg was embarking in this is that they would do the reassessment and for the first few years after the reassessment, we'll see an uptick in residential homeowners, like the SCARS petitions, which again, isn't great because we're seeing a big uptick in that, so sometimes that shifts our assessed valuation, and we have been kind of dealing with the aftermath of that reassessment in terms of not always having as accurate as we would like assessed valuation numbers for our tax rate information. But the long-term idea is the reassessment should eventually, between the tax certs that we're settling and the fact that all these properties were reassessed, including the non-homestead, that it should be lowering, like, the amount of liability.
uncertainty.
Uncertainty of
Right?
it.
We should
So
lower
I
that.
think
'cause
as we look at the tax certiorari reserve, the reassessment we should start seeing where people are being taxed closer to where they will not be able to have a claim against us, or that the claim should be a little bit lower, because the idea is that the assessment was done more recently, and it should be more accurate and reflect what the value.
Yeah, and now it's a rolling assessment too
Yeah.
they're doing.
So I think that as, I don't see, and most districts are still having a certain level of claims. I would say that I've seen like a slowdown a bit, and maybe that's, in terms of the filing, and that may be partially due to the assessed values of those properties being adjusted more, done, like, as you said, annually, and it was done a very wide range reassessment. So I think in places where I think the city of Rye had done one years ago, and I think what their experience is, and Pelham had done it as well, is what we're kind of hoping to see here, where the claims will start being less because the assessments are closer to what they need to be. But I guess my point in even saying all that is that, there's times in which in the past we were like, listen, we need to have X amount of dollars in there because we know we have a lot of claims. I think the recommendation right now, as you see it, is that we currently have potentially a couple other small ticket claims that we will pay out of there in the next year or so. As we pay it, and the amount that we feel is that was being held for that particular claim size, we release it to balance the budget. But I think we don't have to be I think we're comfortable with the amount of money we have in there. We'll look at how that looks going forward, and based upon, the assumption that we'll be settling some claims each year. I think the current recommendation is that I think keeping that fund around that 1.5 million, range, or at least $1 million or so is where we want to be, because then if there is one that comes up that's a little bit higher, we can handle it without borrowing for it. When I first, the first 10 years I worked here, we didn't have a tax actuary, and they only borrowed. And that was when the interest rates on debt. So districts don't always have a tax actuary. You can also, you're allowed to legally, like, it doesn't require a vote of the public. The board can, if we owe something, we borrow money and we pay it. But I think it's better.
And doesn't that sound like where we'll eventually get? I mean,
But if you don't need a big reserve.
obviously, your office has been involved in making sure we actually have that line above zero, well above zero, 7-digit line. But if we were to just, take that into account, over the next 6 years, we should assume that sooner or later, we're gonna have $1 million payout, and then another $1 million payout, and that fund balance will be gone.
Possibly.
Assuming that we're gonna pay 40% on the $12 million of claims, we are eventually in the 4 to 6 year range. It's a probability, a possibility, that we will be needing to raise revenue or take on new debt to cover that. And it's a
Well, that's
gift,
assuming if we-
that 9 isn't zero right now.
Right.
But it's the assumptions that, you put out as, reasonable, that, we do have a liability from claims that are current.
Right.
So if in the near future, that'll be a strain on budgets, that our town and our budget office would, I guess, determine whether we would add debt to spread out the pain.
Or there may be a
whether-
year we might say, like, this is a year we want to put more money in the capital reserve. Like, if we have some, as we're always I would hope, that there's always going to be some monies at the end of the fiscal year that either revenues over expenditures. And I think, looking at where our current claims are and just getting a sense of where, we're alerted to when things are close to settlement, right? By the attorneys that are involved, they'll say, this one is now, it's on the docket, it's, they're looking to kind of settle it. Interestingly enough, most, these type of claims, and I was told this very early on, the attorneys that handle them, not for us, of course, for the people filing against us, they want them to be multi-year settlements because they get, like, it benefits them, the attorneys, actually the attorneys.
Spreads out their fees,
Yeah,
they have a little.
it makes better, they get a bigger chunk of it. It's actually, why, my understanding is why they're not settled more quickly,
Rigorously.
Because I think, as we know, what we're really saying here is that we're receiving taxes now that we have to get back. I mean, that's really what tax surcharge means. And many times, although we, depending on how, how reasonable the person or the claim is, it takes some time to get to a good settlement on it, but it is, in fact, a real liability. So I think it is always in our best interest to, have, I think, a reasonable amount of money in there. And I think as we look over the next couple of years, and we'll talk about it as we look at the entire reserves, where we currently are and where we, again, anticipating to be without having a 100% certainty on like how each year will pan out. But I think right now, where we are, we're at a good place, and we may, if there's opportunities to put a little bit of money back there, but I think over the next few years, we'll be able to handle anything that comes to us, at least for the next 4 years or 5 years, based upon my understanding of the timing on some of these claims. The next one on the list is the employee accrued liability reserve. And again, just to give you the definitions, which are also in your slide deck, this reserve is required. So there's many employees in the district that are 12-month employees, and by contract, they may have, they do have payouts on vacation or different things. And I know that it's a large number, but that's for a lot of it. There's a good number of employees that fall into that category. I think it's about 40 or 50 people. So that represents anything that they would be possibly due on retirement, and that is an estimate based on current staffing, and it's based upon their salaries in different years, and so it ranges from people who don't make as much to people who make more on their per
But
diem.
what gets paid out of that?
Vacation pay. So That doesn't necessarily mean that'll be your liability. That's saying at an end of a fiscal year, if people have a certain amount of accrued vacation time they have not taken, and they left tomorrow, what would your liability be? That's how that
okay,
number's
okay,
determined.
gotcha.
Now, sometimes when people are retiring, they start banging out days, and that number could be like less by the time they leave. We had an employee this year who took the time, so we didn't pay her out, but she wasn't here. I mean, you still have an expense, because then you may have to have another employee cover that. So, interestingly.
In that second case, does this money apply as well?
Excuse me?
In the second case you just
No,
mentioned?
it doesn't. This
Okay.
is only for pure payouts.
Okay.
If you could picture someone, you know, if everybody retired, that's their money, not our district's money. And if 2 months before they retired, they decided to take their vacations, they would get their salary,
Oh, in lieu of, right.
and they wouldn't retire with,
Right.
you know, any vacation pay coming to
Right.
them.
Gotcha.
So
And-
it's unlikely
yeah.
that we're gonna give all $700,000 to
Right.
our employees,
No.
but.
But it is a
and
liability
wouldn't
that
be
you
in
have to-
1 year,
Right.
Right.
because these
No,
are
everybody were
many
retiring
people
all
who
But
are
the way
not
you,
ready to
right,
retire.
but on your, and this is part
But
of what,
it's-
yeah.
It's not our money, and
it's
that's,
not,
that
but it-
one's really
That's
a
why it's
different
required, I
type
guess?
of,
Yeah.
Excuse me, but this is one that, like, as part of your audited statements, like, you do have to retain that money. So it's like, you know, money that it's not like it's in a bank, but it's like really reserved for this, particular purpose. But Jeremy's correct in that it would be unlikely, and it would never be that everyone would retire, but it's saying at the end of that fiscal year, what was your liability for
Balance
the
in the
people
books,
that would
kind
be
of, yeah.
required? That all the people, and some people wouldn't even be close to eligible to retirement. So to Jeremy's point, it would, you know, there's only gonna be few and far between. But if people were to leave service, I know we spoke about, in one of our contracts last year, we actually limited, there was, just, you know, over the years, some contracts that had an unlimited number of days you could accrue, and that was one of one of the contracts we did change the cap to reduce that, which was important, because I think that's one of the ways to cap this. Although it is a large number, a lot of districts, which we do not have, but there are districts in Westchester, I think, who are trying to get away from it, but that pay out sick time too. We do not have that provision, so it is only for vacation, where their liability numbers are millions of dollars for this type of line item. Again,
I'm sorry.
yep,
In districts where sick time is paid out, is that a local like a local
the
contractual
local
issue?
contract, yeah, it's a
Okay,
local
just
contractual
okay.
issue. But I'm saying is, it's not, not saying I know exactly where, I know for a fact it exists in
No, it's
certain
interesting
places.
to know.
But it's something that I think as time goes on, I think people are like trying to get those type of provisions out, because they can be very costly, more so than even vacation time, quite frankly. Okay, so the next one, retirement systems contribution. This reserve is specifically set up for what is called our employee retirement system. So that is for the employees that are non-teachers, that are part of a separate retirement system. In our budget books, it's always represented as two separate line items: employee retirement system and teachers retirement system. Because this is a reserve that is also used by municipalities, the state, majority of people in the state are in this retirement system. So the way we're able to fund that is actually, believe it or not, we're allowed to keep more monies in that reserve than we are in our TRS reserve, because the way you calculate your max amount you're allowed to keep in there is about 3 times your yearly bill, is what it is, okay? So our yearly bill for that retirement system this year is about $800,000, so that means we can keep up to 2.4 in there. But interestingly enough.
What does that mean?
So-
What is the retirement bill?
So so we have 2 different retirements, 2 different line items in our budget, and we're required to state it that way, because they're 2 separate liabilities. One is the teachers' retirement system, which is our much larger liability,
Right.
and it's for all teachers and administrators that are in that retirement system.
Yeah.
We pay, and teacher assistants, we pay the retirement system for the contributions owed for those employees. And then there is an employee retirement system, and that is for teacher teacher aides, all the office staff, all the custodial staff, and people like that would fall into that retirement system. It's a separate line item. There's 2 separate reserves. It's a bit confusing. One is, and they have different names. One is a retirement system reserve. That was the first one that the state ever established, and that was exclusively for people who are in the employee retirement system. When it was initially established, there was
TRS.
no ability to reserve for your teacher's retirement system payments. It was exclusively for this group of employees. And the thinking, or which I'm sure is correct, the state established this because it's not only for school districts, it's for the state, it's for municipalities, counties, everyone, everyone else except schools has everyone in the other retirement system. The state is the one who legally puts these type of reserves into law. They have to approve them, they create them so that schools then can use them. They created it well before the TRS reserve when the state, when the pension payments were going up, as a way for everyone to be able to sock away some monies to help offset as there's volatility in the rates and the expenses, and not to be hit with big upticks in any given year. But interestingly for us, we are allowed to keep more money, although it's a smaller liability for us each year, because the rules around each reserve has certain rules to it, like you have to have a real liability. So with these, it's based on a local calculation of how much you can keep in there. It's 3 years of what your current bill is. So if our current bill is $700,000, it'd be $2.1 million. We're allowed to keep at the max. I'm not saying we have to keep that. I'm saying that would be the maximum. We couldn't keep $4 million in that reserve, is what I'm trying to say. So,
But we don't pay it out of the reserve. It's still a line item in our budget
but we
that
bring it
pay.
in the revenue to offset the expense.
What happens is, let's say in the investment market
Yeah.
that funds that retirement system, they make a return of whatever. The gap between what they make and what they projected is then funded out of the reserve locally. Would that be accurate?
Well, I think right, and I think there's different ways. We stayed in the budget on two, it's almost like what we're doing with this transfer out. We're saying, here's the expense, but we have this reserve that we're using to pay for some of that expense this year. So you're seeing it as a revenue line item, and you're also seeing the expenditure in the budget. Now, the revenue line item, just to be clear this year, that number represents monies towards paying the ERS as well as the TRS, because you can blend, you have to keep it in separate line items, but when I bring it in, I'm deducting some from one and some from the other.
Okay.
But if we talk about that, so one way we're raising money this year and the last couple of years is we're using certain reserves. So Maureen's, thank you, referencing the $650,000 from our, our first page that's coming out of our retirement reserve.
So which one's
And
that?
you don't see it coming from one of the, but it's addressing two of our liabilities.
ERS and TRS.
And but that's different than what you were saying. Every year we get a bill to contribute to our teachers' retirement,
Yes.
and that's already budgeted,
Yes.
and we pay it. And every year we get a bill to contribute to our employees who aren't teachers, and that's already budgeted.
Right.
But we're allowed to have extra money beyond what we're paying. We're paying our bill every year. So these are actual reserves above, that have been allocated there, that in the last 2 years specifically, we have used a significant amount to pay that bill. But if I was asking the same as what Doreen, 2 years ago we spent almost $1 million of this reserve.
Right.
This year we're going to spend closer to $500,000. I don't see anywhere up there where our numbers went down by 1.5 million.
Because
So what are we
okay,
missing?
so two things are happening here. So, and I know it's a bit confusing. I have to kind of show each line item, and that may be easier to see. So, if we were to look at the retirement system contribution, let's look at it at the end of 22. Let's look at it.
But it looks really flat over 5 years.
Right, but what's actually happening, right, in the background is, we're looking at the end of 2 fiscal years. What happens is, we have 1.5 million in the retirement reserve as of June 2021. And then we said, okay, we're going to appropriate, as part of our budget plan, X amount of dollars, which we do. You approve it, it goes to the voters. Then we close our books for the year and we say, okay, we have $1 million left. How do we want to use this money? Do we want to put it in the capital reserve? Do we want to replenish, this? We have the opportunity now to put some money back in it. So it's almost like starting balance, a reduction of what you appropriated and then a plus of what you added back. That's really the math. When you're seeing it year to year, you're seeing the, the net effect, right? Like, you're not seeing the ins and outs. I think when we do the audit report each year, we discuss that in detail about when we talk about the reserves. That's, I think, I know it's maybe at the time it kind of is with everything else that's being spoken about those evenings, but the auditors kind of walk us through, like, Jeff, I know he spoke a lot about the reserves that night when he presented the financial statements about, how you have your kind of beginning balance and how, like, what happens, like, okay, then you had where you actually ended at the end of the fiscal year, right? So you had what you thought you could spend out of the reserves to budget next year's budget, knowing that there'd be some ability to replenish some of them. And that's where each year when I show you where the estimate is, that's kind of saying, yes, we're taking monies out, but we also know we'll be able to replenish some of them by, because this year we're going to have additional revenues of X and expenditure savings of Y. And that's why when we look at our budget, we see our beginning budget, our actuals, and then our proposed, right? So when we look at our actuals and you see, okay, oh, wow, like that line item's $300,000 more than we anticipated, what happens to those dollars, right? Those get put back into reserves, right? That's how reserves are funded. But it's sort of it's an accounting in some ways. I guess there's different ways you could consider it, but I think that's how districts, even like ours, like, people have reserves, they use them, but then they have money again, and then the next year it's the same process. So
this is like, so if I look at, sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
if I look at the estimated end of year for this year,
Yep.
the total is about 54 million, let's say, right?
Yep.
And if I look at the estimated receipts, the revenue is 55 million.
Right.
So that's a difference of a little over 1 million.
Yep.
So and then you'll figure out which of
Yes.
that 1 million, then you'll throw it in here.
Yes, exactly.
Got it.
And some of the
And then
things-
are we
yeah.
making, sorry, one last question.
Yep.
Are we making, because the interest rates have been going up, I'm assuming these are in safe, like savings accounts, but the interest rates are going up. Right.
Well, I know,
We must be making
yeah,
a nice amount in interest.
Yep. Yeah, we definitely are. I mean, I think that's one of the areas this year as we look at our estimated end of year, and we bumped up our interest projections for next year, quite a bit based upon our actual, and similar to most districts, and we're always definitely, as we are with a lot of numbers, but interest conservative, although I think we all know that, it's not going down, the Fed's not going to cut the rate, and if anything, it may increase it. So, yes, we are receiving significantly more than what we budgeted, and we also did make some of that. We did adjust what our projected interest rate was as part of our budget proposal for next year. So, but that is one of the areas that would be an example of a place where when you have excess money, that's how it helps replenish some of them. And actually, when we appropriate, so when you see the word assigned fund balance, and now I'm kind of jumping down, the assigned fund balance is really those reserves that's being assigned to be used for next year's budget. That's part of that number. That's kind of part of how you have your reserve, and if you think about it, like, you have $1 million, you're like, I'm going to use 200,000 of that to balance next year's budget. That drops from the reserve number down to the assigned number. Then you add back. I mean, it's like sometimes you have to kind of see the math in between to kind of get it. But if you can imagine that, that's why sometimes as you look year over year, it looks as though they're relatively flat, but it's like, why? Because we assigned some, but we were able to replenish. And I think as we look to what we're assigning next year, some of the thinking is that we'll be able to replenish some of those numbers. I think if we weren't, as an example, interest, state aid, county sales tax, we're just on the revenue side of the budget where we're seeing, receipts, and even actually our tuition numbers have been really much better than anticipated based upon our initial numbers that we had, where we're seeing those additional revenues come in. We're comfortable in assigning some of that fund balance, knowing we're replenishing some of it by those dollars. I just wanted to, if you think, if this is good, I'll just walk through the remainder of the reserve type items we have. The next large one is the liability reserve. This is a reserve that we newly created in June of 2020, and it was one that actually, my understanding, like ourselves, a lot of districts now have established this. And actually this reserve, the full name of it is the Liabilities Claims Reserve Property Loss Reserve Fund. And really, we've been using it primarily because, similar to a lot of other districts, we do have more so on the liability claims around, settlements to parents. It could be anything, but any active litigation that we know is going to result in a settlement that we're currently locked into, or claims that are filed against the district. And how that number is determined, quite frankly, is we know because people file against us with what they're looking for, and the liability reserve has been really very a good thing for our budgeting as well, because especially in the last 5 years where we've seen a tremendous amount of settlements that the district has paid out. And again, that's not unique to Hastings. I don't say that in a negative way. I'm just saying, just realistically, this is something that is more common, and many of these settlements we pay out because of the timing of settlements and litigation. A lot of times we're paying past years back, right? So, it's one thing if you're like just paying the year in the expenses incurred, but typically, as the board knows, because you see some of the details behind those settlements, many of them are going back 2 and 3 school years. And I'm talking primarily about because it's part of, what we approve in public session, parent settlements for students that are placed out of district. And currently, the liabilities we're tied into many. We have a lot of claims still filed against us that we don't know the outcome of. But as our attorneys, in order for us to hold a certain amount of, it's not like I just come up with I think it'll be this. Those are confirmed. Our accountants, independent of us, our attorneys have to provide them legal documentation with the amount of liabilities, and it's more than what we accrue for.
Right.
So it's not like just a place to park money. It has to be a place where this is something relatively new, but it's really based on what we currently owe, what we may owe, and ensuring, and that's not only for these type of settlements, because we do have a few other litigations that could exceed our insurance at times, depending on the nature of them, that we may not be covered. I mean, it is mostly for for students, settlements. So
placed.
I just want to, just show you, as we look at that, and you look at what I'm anticipating that we're going to need at the last couple of years, we've put quite a bit of money in that, but that's also another line we've put in, we've taken out, we've put back in, and we've in some years paid out $600,000 and $700,000, and that's only sometimes to settle. There's still claims that we had to settle.
And just to point out, I think everybody knows, but that's part of the process, unfortunately, in New York State. It's
Yes,
not unique at all to Hastings. In fact, it's a bad process, and the New York State School Board Association, one of their key lobbying points is to change that process for when placing kids out of district. It doesn't have to go through this whole legal process of
No,
suing.
it's just, like you said,
Right.
it's the state, it has nothing to do with our parents, it's not unique to Hastings.
No.
It's just based upon how things work.
Yeah.
So it's not even it's like, it sounds kind of like litigation or something, but it's really just, as you said, Alex, the process is flawed, and it requires, unfortunately, this is somewhat, what the outcome of that flawed process has
Right.
been, and it is a very common thing amongst at least the school districts I'm aware of, and colleagues that I speak to, that those who didn't have this have now established, because without having this, it would kind of require you to have to even sometimes budget, like it made it even harder to budget what you would anticipate that. By at least using what we currently have some sense of what some of the liabilities are, with some of legal guidance and some direction, we're able to at least have some money set aside there to, again, it's similar to tax certiorari, to kind of, as we're looking out in the next couple of years, it helps us to, as we have funds available, put some money in there to stabilize. We in the past used to budget this right in the special ed portion of the budget under the line settlements. It wasn't very subtle, but that's what it was. And we also had as part of our budget, I don't know if you noticed, our litigation costs under legal, we've been able, because you're also able to reserve for like unanticipated liability or keep a little bit of a buffer, so we don't have to guesstimate, oh, we're going to spend a lot in litigation next year. By having the liability reserve, it allows us some flexibility of not having, if our liability in litigation was significantly above, we're able to take some money out of this also to address that if needed. But it is one that we are recommending, again, it is less than 1.3 million as we speak today, but as we close out this year, there will be a recommendation to replenish some of the money there because we've spent about, I think, 500,000 or so out of that this year thus far, and I think there are maybe a few more that'll.
And that recommendation comes as we close out the books.
Yes, it'll be like the end
I
of May.
think that's what Doreen was getting to. You know, if the two numbers you mentioned, it looks like we have about $1.2 million that was, you know, extra revenue or less expenditures.
Well, it's more than that.
We're doing the 53.9 to the 55.1.
Difference between the two, right.
Right, so
Yeah.
it's like 1.2
Oh,
million.
yeah, two, yeah, but it probably be a
1.2
little bit
million,
more.
and then at some point, the administration and the budget office will come and say, of that 1.2, we'd like to put,
Yes.
we'd like to replenish the settlements, not
Right.
placements. When we place students, that goes in our budget.
Correct,
Right, settlements are for when parents have a difference of opinion
Correct.
with what we wanted to, and then they ask us to pay for where they want to send their kids. So of that 1.2, at some point, that does come to us, and that's after budget season.
Correct.
Because that's when we wrap it up.
Right.
And that's obviously something we have, we could discuss then, you know, what sort of reserves would we like to fund, but the truth is, as in most things, you know, the seven of us are the least informed of where that 1.2 should go, and the seven on your side are the more
well,
informed.
I think it's like everything else, each of them is really based on what currently is happening in the district, right? So how many tax certiorari's do we have? What's the likelihood of them being settled? When do we anticipate those being settled? What liabilities do we have that we know are going to be within the next, 12 to 24 months? And, that's where the determination to where those funds are placed are based upon, speaking with counsel and having a pretty, trying to be as informed as possible where, especially anything to do with liability, you have TRS and ERS reserves, which are excellent, and we should absolutely be funding those as well. But at times, if we know we have an urgency around, or we're going to have this big liability, then of course, I would say, okay, fund that at a higher level because we know we're going to be paying that out next year. So, yes, so when we make those recommendations, we try our best to kind of do it based upon what we think in the next couple of years is going to be a place where we're absolutely going to need to increase or have a certain level of funding.
So my challenge when talking about the funds or trying to, predict or plan for the funds is not so much like which one of these numbers do we have. Every fund that we have a balance above zero is a benefit to our district and a benefit to our residents. And here's a lot of examples where our budget office has, put different funds together, created some of them recently, so that our year-to-year, budgets can have less variability. So that, and I'm sure the next ones are going to be similar. They're certainly a lot smaller, except for TRS sub-reserve. The next four, future capital projects is obviously coming up, and that's a big one there. But I think I have two challenges. One, what defines when we call it a one-time expense and put it in our budget, and when do we, come out of it from the capital? But what challenges me, my understanding is if we look at that line, total assigned fund balances, when you get to that, I believe that one really overlaps with our budget decisions.
Yes.
So this year, we're planning on, and it's not a shock, but we have $1 million ready to go from our fund balances to put right towards our budget revenue. And I think the challenge I see is we're not as clear about when would that suddenly disappear. I think I've inaccurately referred to it a couple times as, we've over raised revenue from our residents. This year, again, another million, and then it immediately, you know, the budget office, no, it's immediately going to what we expect. We're ready to spend another million. But if we could get this conversation maybe towards that, you know, by the next slide, when would this board ever know that we are actually gonna spend what we're raising?
Where are you getting
We're-
where are you getting the million? I just wanna see, he's mentioning that one
So
number.
that
Because-
line, total assigned fund balance that you're looking at for maybe
Right.
950,000?
But why does it say then on this first sheet that we're taking 650 from retirement reserve and 100,000?
350.
Yeah, I didn't tweak this last now, because this is the one I
Well,
pulled
Because
from the
this
last.
only equals 750,
All right,
that's
so-
why I'm
well,
just a
No,
little
that
confused.
adds up to
It's-
1.1.
No, it's 750, it's
Add
more
the
than that. It's like
appropriated
one, yeah,
balance.
it's
Oh, and the
balance,
appropriated
yeah.
balance is part of that.
Can I,
Appropriated balance is one
Yeah.
of these.
That would be where I would
Sorry.
want a budget session, work session to discuss how would, and I would even bring it back to last year's budget. There was a big challenge, you know, when the budget got voted down, to change the level of growth, whether it was called cut or less growth. And a lot of, you know, the field was like, there's not a lot to cut here, guys. Be careful, let's see if the community is ready to support it. And that's, you know, a very rare thing, but when that happens, we didn't have a discussion that said, oh, you know what, we have 55 million in the budget, but it's quite likely that we're only gonna spend 54 million.
But Jeremy,
Can I say-
nobody ever knows that, because as we
Yeah.
can go,
Exactly,
no, but I'm
exactly.
saying as we go through it, and we've had this discussion before, and I mean, I'll sit here and go line by line item with you tonight, as we do in the finance and at the audit time. I mean, where you start versus, and many of this, as I mentioned, I think even to you in the finance committee, currently our special ed budget is trending about 800,000 or so less than we budgeted. It was based upon students. I can go through, I think it would be kind of inappropriate to the individual students, but there was, you know, you have people that we planned to be out and their parents pulled them. We're gonna pay for them. We're just not gonna pay for them this year. So to say last year when we made budget decisions, it was based upon what we believed financially we had to commit to certain students. If their parents made other decisions, if people moved, if placements changed, and with special ed in particular, you could, volatility of like 5 or 6 students, you're talking about, could be close to $1 million. That's a
Exactly.
fact. So I think, you know, as we talk about budgets, like, oh, well, can we do it closer to the bone? I'm like, should I just say, well, let's just not budget for some of these people, or like, let's, you know, let's predict that this person's gonna work here next year and they're not gonna take a leave of absence, and I should have anticipated that, like, and then the replacement's significantly less. So
Yep.
when we put our budget together, we base it upon the staffing that we're told, with some of course, there may be some predictions, like, I don't know, everyone will be hired next year with the 10 people, so there could be people more or less. You know, I'm always hoping less, but sometimes it's more, sometimes it is less. Sometimes people need family health insurance benefits that are $30,000. Some people are 25 years old and on their parents', you know, plan. And this happens every year, somebody gets married and they had a family, or they switch to their spouse's insurance and we save $30,000, that's one person. So when you talk about budget volatility, $1 million in a budget of 55 million, I know people may think, oh, like, you're so inaccurate. That's not inaccurate. That's pretty, like, it's almost like, yeah, we lucked out. Like, I look at it as like, you know, we're fortunate when we save money. There could be a number you could say, well, you know, maybe that was like a little bit higher, you know, we could have went a little lower thinking on that particular number, that, you know, this and that number. You know, employees coming in, if I don't know if an employee's in tier 4 or tier 6 of the employee, you know, so
Yeah,
we
no, I
typically
think,
budget, and even this year, there were a couple of teachers that took leave of, I
yeah,
just want to,
can I just put it in
no,
perspective?
but I just think it's
Right,
like,
right, right.
I think this is asked, and I think
It's a
it's
couple,
almost as though like we're over budgeting, and this,
Right.
and I feel like it's
1.8% differential.
it's
Right,
a
so-
1.8 different on that, it's
Well,
like,
there's a lot of ways to play with numbers, and
No,
I'm
no,
gonna let
but-
Alex jump in, but it's not a 1.8% number when 80% of your budget is a fixed cost. So in that sense, you know, we gotta be careful with numbers, but I hear what you're saying, and I'm gonna let Alex, I'm specifically trying not to insinuate. I was saying, you know, my misstatements in other years, in other meetings, have implied that it's an over-rev. I'd like to address it from a different tone, because it's not, it is what you said, Maureen, and it is a 2% number in the total budget, but I'm going to let Alex jump in.
I'm trying to, and my daughter's locked out of the house, but I'm trying to let her manage it.
Windows.
Windows.
Well, if we know how to get
Don't you
to
have
your
the
house
secret
now.
hidden key?
I do, but it's.
Under the fake rock? Totally,
Yeah.
under the fake rock in front of your house?
My house
And my son's home, so I don't know where he is, so. But the main thing about it
Yeah,
is,
my
right,
story.
it's just,
My house got broken into.
right,
once.
you can err on the side of caution, or you can err on the side of error. And those are your only two choices in a budgeting situation, and so obviously, erring on the side of caution. And this $1 million doesn't constantly accrue, it's kind of just, it goes in and out, it's sort of the buffer. It doesn't really change, its value doesn't change. And it's all, it's sort of a distinction without difference, or a difference without distinction, because it's taxpayer monies, and if we don't have to charge them for it in the present year because we have it already from the previous year. In the scheme of things, if you take the average income in this town, it's a couple $1,000s, sort of, meaning that the point is, the same thing you would do in your own household is what we do on a larger scale. No one's like, oh, you know what, I think I'm gonna spend this much this year, I'm gonna take a couple extra weeks off. We always err on the side of caution, and it is a fairly small cautionary buffer, that because we've talked about this before, what happened if you didn't have money for something and you suddenly needed it, and choices are all pretty bad. So it sort of behooves us to have some buffer, and that's what it is. It doesn't constantly grow, it's just there to protect us. It's
Yeah,
like an
and I think
insurance.
the other idea is the idea is every district has reserves, right? Reserves exist because of this. That the reserves don't exist without having savings. That's how every district in the state of New York, and every village, and every town, and every county, and including the New York State, has money because at the end of their fiscal year, they have money left over in their budget. And
Exactly.
So I mean,
That's-
that's how it works. Like, there's never a budget, and we have, many years ago, not that it matters, but when I was first here, there was when I was first here, they had to actually cancel hundreds because they were, we would have been in the negative at the end of the year. So it didn't happen often, but it can happen. It doesn't happen.
What did they cancel, I'm sorry?
It was determined at one point when I was just first year in a very different role, it was that we were gonna overexpend our budget. And although you can technically, because you just take it out of your appropriated fund, you take it out of your, unassigned fund balance, you are allowed to do it.
Yeah.
It's typically not a good practice, and it results in a much lower bond rating, and it really.
But that was more than 20 years ago then?
Yeah, no, it was.
Okay.
And I'm not suggesting that we're in any risk of doing that. And I think especially since the property tax came in, and it's always like a very difficult place to be. I understand there's like a fine balance in like over-reserving, over-tax, all these ideas, but I think, we do try our best, and we do see the biggest variation, quite frankly, in this district at least, has been in the area of special ed, and that is true.
Yeah, I'd like to then refocus it, because Alex, I think what we're discussing, and it's not the first time, but if what I'm hearing, like what Maureen said, we budgeted for 55.3 million, and if a couple families hadn't pulled out and the special ed savings hadn't been there, we would have spent that.
Or more, yeah.
Or more, exactly. So when we're looking at this budget, that 950,000 that we're getting from reserves could have not been there.
Possible, yeah.
And when would the board ever know that it's about to be gone? There's 1.1 million that this year we're able to use. I feel it's a blind spot for the board, for the amateurs that we are, in saying it. I mean, the good side is that what you want to say, we've always had it, it's fiscal conservative. And that's the other side. It's been many, many years of a 7-figure conservative budgeting or things going our way, When would the board ever know that, hey, last year when we had to come back with a second budget and we trimmed things, we're coming closer to the bone this time? I don't think the board ever, has that expertise or the experience to know it. And it sounds like this year we're using about, 1 million to help this budget here. And it also sounds at the same time, Maureen, that it could have not been there, that 1 million.
Well, I mean, I think.
Like, it could have not been there,
Listen,
and then we would have had to
Each year,
spend.
but there's always variations in like what actually happens, and then we may have made other decisions to like cut back other things. I mean, there may be things that we may not have recommended to do this year. Like, so I think there's always gonna be hopefully a certain amount of money, or else like if there's no money, there's a real
Then we're
problem.
going into reserves
Yeah, there's a
and
real
trouble.
problem. I
Yes.
mean, so on the revenue side, you're always going to, with the interest, I think, not only myself, but, as I looked around, and similarly, everyone's changing their projections for next year. Even the projection for interest next year is less than what we're receiving this year. We're still being conservative. We're still saying, let's just be careful in the event, like, I don't project that to happen. It's still bumped up a couple $100,000, but we are making, a good amount of money. But we're still not going like right to the, like, even with tuitions, like, unless we're guaranteed it, we're always gonna be conservative, as is everyone on the revenue side of it. And even similarly on the, expenditure side, when we're projecting new staff, I think we put a number in, but the messaging is like cheaper. You
Just
know
to
what I
point
mean?
out-
Like, so that's how you get extra money.
Yeah.
I mean, to your point, Jeremy, every month, you're getting a monthly expenditure report and
Yeah.
revenue report. So every month, and I look at that with
Yeah.
Maureen every month, and that's gonna give you sort of
Granular look.
an idea that something's shifting, and if we're on our game and Maureen's on our game for sure, we're gonna say, this month you had that, but please watch out.
Would
If
that
that's
be
what you're
that,
asking, you're asking
little
that
bit,
if
yeah.
there's, I'll round it, right, we got 1 million, but suddenly, oh my gosh, it's 500,000, what happened? I'm
Right,
going
we would,
extreme, but in the monthlies, you should be seeing that, and we.
but
should
if
be-
we were hitting our
sorry.
number, that would be significant difference than what we usually do.
Right,
If your
and-
monthlies were coming in on target, that would be a warning sign to
Well, and
us.
knowing that the monthlies aren't necessarily perfect, because
There's
there's ebbs
different
and flows,
payments.
but you're
But
that's
right,
a-
we
but that-
monitored every day. If there was
you
ever an
monitor every
issue, I
day,
would
I
let,
see it every month,
Like, right, when are we getting our bill?
I've had to lead a district in a even maybe wealthier community where they didn't have the
Definitely.
reserve, and we had to cut back, it was Weston. We had to, 3 of the 5 years I was there, with a great budget director who's now running the budgets in Darien, Connecticut, so really, really good. We had to, about 3 months, 4 months before the end of the year, 3 out of the 5 years, start cutting back and telling people we're freezing budgets and all the rest. We
You didn't have the reserves because of law or because of
Connecticut has-
philosophical
law,
differences?
because of law.
Connecticut has different reserve laws.
And the thing that tripped us was great need for special ed had to be there, and out-of-district placements that went way beyond what and different budgeting process in Connecticut, so that question of
Yeah.
a reserve, where we tried to build into the operating budget a reserve for the special ed out-of-district, every year that was the debate, because it was, are you taxing people for unused money? Well, we're trying to avoid the
No,
problem.
even when we do, we
So
put
there's
it in
several-
reserves and we carefully,
Yeah, so New York
spend
State
it.
allows a little, and there are reserves in Connecticut. Don't hear me, there aren't. There are, but it's trickier to establish them and manage them, and they're more on the capital side
Perfect.
than the operating, if that's helpful.
No, it's very helpful. I think, as a board decisions, we don't second guess administration decisions, and we value their expertise. And this year, obviously we're voting in a week. We're not here to discuss particulars, A proposal came this year that says, hey, we have an opportunity and an obligation to better serve some of our highest needs in specialized education. And it's like, hey, here's the plan, our experts in the department and the budget have come together. And they're like, I think, your community should do this. Support it for moral reasons, support it because it's a need for about 4 to 7 of our students, and it could work out. And it's brought to the board as like, hey, it's about $500,000 this year and probably another $500,000 next year. And it's all great, because that's not our job to decide, which programs to support. Our job's to find administrators that, bring us reasonable, fabulous ideas. We will not really know when this, when our ability to pay that $700,000 bill for the TRS and the employee benefits isn't gonna be able to roll over. But at the same point, we do know, because it's been there consistently. So I think a lot of us see that total assigned fund balance, and it is a challenge for a very young new board. You know, we typically have a majority of us in our first term. You know, wow, we're spending another $1 million, last year $2 million, that we had available. So it would be something to consider as we approve new projects, as we approve new growth, like, hey, we can handle this. We have the reserves for our liability. Hey, we can grow the special ed. We have, you know, the capital fund future is up at 1.8. I don't know, I mean, thank you, Bill. It's like the monthlies would give us an idea, or at the end of 1 year. But at some point, you would figure those 6 families aren't gonna surprise us to the downside. And you'd assume, and even though, right, we plan for 3.5% interest, even though it's likely we're gonna get 4.5. We plan for 300,000 from other school districts, even though we're hoping or expecting it might be 5. There's ways to be fiscally conservative.
Right, but and across a lot of line items.
Across
It
a
adds
lot
up,
of
right.
line
A
items,
little bit of
we
caution
put in,
adds up to a
you know,
lot of
I believe, Maureen, you have lines where it is, you know, we expect to have leave replacements, you know, based on having 200 teachers. We know 1 or 2,
People out, right.
we're gonna pay for multiple teachers. We have that, and oh my God, that year we didn't use any. It looks like we over budgeted. No, we didn't over budget. We did what was typical, and that, or the opposite. But when that disappears, it does put pressure. You know, if we have that year where we don't have this $1 million, that puts a lot of pressure. If we have that year when we're gonna pay out the $3 million for the tax centauri, it starts putting pressure on it. And it's a real benefit, all of these budget reserves, all of this future planning, that in years like this, we don't have that pressure. And we're able to continually keep tax increases at 3% for our residents, 4% for budget to budget. And I just, you know, it's a real challenge to understand, when is it gonna be gone? Or is it never gonna be gone? When would we ever not have that extra funding from reserves to support our budget?
I'm
That's sort of where I want the board to just feel like they've had that conversation.
So I think, so my biggest fear in a situation like that is actually, personnel related, meaning, Maureen has a philosophy that over the last 7 years I've gotten to know, which is, conservative, a little bit conservative on a lot of line items, which creates, if 1 or 2 things break, you have the buffer in the other line items. One of my biggest concerns is, because we've seen in other districts, Bedford recently, they budget close to the bone. You have someone who budgets who doesn't have that philosophical take. Board members aren't aware of it. It gets really close, and all of a sudden, so for example, we think about facilities, right? And, Maureen had a decision to make about, so first Tesfa and Laura come and they say, we want this room. We look at it, and from an academic perspective, it makes sense. So then the question to Maureen is, well, how do we budget for that? What do we do? Do we just add it to the straight, do we take it out of appropriated? Do we take it out of reserves? How much do we pay for it in a given year? Do we do capital reserves? There was a lot of different ways. So she made a philosophical call not to use capital reserves for that, because she's looking at, conservatively, 15 million potential dollars in projects that are coming down the pike in the next 5 years. But a different finance person might have said, why don't we just take it out of the reserves right now, keep the budget a little bit lower, and then all of a sudden you have a boiler that explodes 3 years from now, and you're having to go out and bond for that, or you have to go borrow for that at really high interest rates. So I think there's 1,000 philosophical decisions, and one of my biggest fears is that, if Maureen's not here and someone else comes in, like, how do, as a board, we need a super who's interviewing a finance person who knows that philosophical take, and all of a sudden, they've got some hidden assumptions, that's probably one of my biggest fears, is that we find someone who doesn't have that small little conservative mindset and, is depleting reserves. And we're not sharp enough as a board to notice this series of 17 different things, how they're all connected. That's the real trick. That's the one thing that keeps me up when I think about it.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's a great testament to Maureen's philosophy and sensibility, how smoothly this district operates. And I keep coming back to it, the fact that, we have much lower debt payments because we're not having to run out in a crisis and bond things. And, the money that gets spent, a lot more of it hits the, that's a bad turn of phrase, but hits the student, so to speak. Like, it's not just soaked up in debt payments. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you, it's the personnel, but I think it's good for us, even tonight, to understand how these things operate so that eventually, whenever it might be, that, so the culture of how this district operates, has some basis for sustaining itself going forward, that we do things the same way, they have the same expectations. Like in Ardsley, they bond very frequently. And I don't remember exactly why, but I think 2015, they had to have a tax cap piercing vote, so.
They definitely just, in Ardsley, I'm just thinking, in the last probably 5 or I don't know how many years, they did have a lot more enrollment. I think they got hit with a lot of the housing that was built in
that was a big thing, yeah.
Too, I think they were kind of like sideswiped, but I do think that especially, and it is challenging, it is even for myself, I'm always thinking about years out, and there is always a little bit of unpredictability because there's nothing that 100% is ever predictable anyway, and especially the last few years, between the pandemic, and then we're gonna lose all this money, which again was told to us by the state. It's not like, we just assume that, and then the federal government, where you're like, where's this money so there's been all this, and now I'm on the other side, kind of like Jeremy, where I also get a bit nervous about, what is the sustainability of the state? Like, realistically, being not a pessimist, I'm an optimist, but in some ways, when it comes to them, I get to be a pessimist.
You get to be both.
But, but you get nervous, you're like, looking at the dollars that are, coming out of the state, their budget, and then, of course, reading, as we all do, anything that is sent to us from the controller, and just, kind of questioning everybody to be thinking about those years. But I think it's each year we also have to make a decision, and yeah, sometimes maybe it's a little bit like if things go in the other direction, it wouldn't be so great, but it's always like a balancing act. And I think just taking everything that's needed, especially like even, as you mentioned, there's things that programmatically come up, and it just is the reality of schools operate very differently than anything else. It's based on children's needs. It's not like a model of creating something in a business where you can kind of scale back things, and our program leaders are required to come and give us what they think they need for their students, and we try to figure out how to do it. But I do think it's been different. The last few years prior to this year, we've also, as we discussed earlier, when Jeremy, you brought up about that position, we have also seen this, and as we're developing, this budget, of course, I'm actively thinking, okay, when that money goes away next year, how then is that going to be added to the budget? So as those things are, as we create our budget plan for the upcoming year, we are thinking about whether it be that particular position, although, we were funding the majority of it, there was that additional monies that we would have had to pick up had we not had a little room to pick it up in the ARP grant. And again, that we still do have some funding from the federal government related to the COVID that we're still receiving, quite frankly, that will help us offset some costs over this summer that we would have had to budget for. So not to scare you more, but I think there are all these kind of things that happen. But but I think as we look at that and consider it, and then think of, as we think about our budget, of course, we do consider, as we did this year, we had 5, significant retirements, not all of which we'll be able to make as large a savings on, but that's another piece of things that occur, right? So you also at different times get, we are looking at, when we look at our budget, we may we don't know exactly when people, but we may guess based upon demographics that certain people are going to retire, so that may also say, okay, well, that year as much as that, but that we'll get a little bit of, we'll get a little breakage there. So there's a lot of factors, but.
And I think it hasn't been transparent to the town, probably even a lot of board members historically, when you had like the aughts where, asset values were going up, there was no tax cap. I don't think people understood how the budget worked, because it was just, okay, here's another program, here's 3 programs we'd like, let's raise the budget 8%. And like that went on for like a decade.
Yeah, when we looked at the average budget increase in the aughts, it was like 8% and change, or 6.7 or something. It was a number that we haven't touched, subsequently.
There have been districts that I'm aware of where, they're ruled by iron fists of certain supers who don't want people to question the budget. I mean, there's different, but I think we're moving more towards transparency. And I think, like for example, this year with the transportation, just being really clear on like 1.7 million. Well, what is actually in the 1.7 million? And I think there's, opportunities for us to be really transparent with the town about, what I think always helps, Maureen, is when you share your thinking. I think A, I think B. In my opinion, this is what we should do, and then the board and the town can vote on that. But what I've often said to Maureen is like, just be really clear about your professional perspective, because I think a lot of times people don't know it. Like you sit there and you go, okay, we can do A, we can do B, we can do C, and then you just show up and you go, A. Let's do A. But like people didn't see all your thinking that went into A, that you actually did consider B and C and D, and that's really important. And then the town might go, great, thanks Maureen for sharing A. I still would pick B, and they'll vote it down. But at least it's transparent, it's out there. I mean, it's hard to do because these budgets are extremely complex. You're making 7 decisions a day. You can show up here and show every decision. But the more we can do that, I think it's valuable, because I've been on the board for 7 years, and I still don't know how parts of this budget work. I mean, there are really arcane laws between how things are moved, where you can put money, what you get, credited back from the state, when and how, and all that kind of stuff. So I know everyone loves in government to use the word transparency and how critically important that is, but sometimes it's hard to make all these decisions transparent. But I think the more that we're doing that, we have been recently, it's valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are transparent, and then there's just things that occur, right? So we set off our spending plan, as does every district, and there's going to be variation in that, because again, it's based upon, we have students that we either currently have, that we may not have, and, we take the factors we do know, students that we're planning for, enrollments that we anticipate, employees that we anticipate having here, what they're currently getting paid, the level of benefits, and try to make a good guesstimate on when we're hiring new staff, what the cost will be for that, and then put that all together and, try to anticipate some other type of needs that may occur, like within the facilities and things like that in different areas. And then the actual year begins. But I think as we look, like there are things that we do know, and I think being that we know a lot of it, to Jeremy's point, there is some variation. Some of it is, pretty much comes in where we anticipate it to come in, and then there is some variation based upon, it could be there's years we have people that need to take time off, and some of it's paid, some of it's not, and depending on which side that lands on, there's going to be a variation to the budget. But again, with a place that is 80% employees, that has a large impact, and then and some of that is based upon the student-specific needs, whether it be aides, assistants, sections. I believe it was last year's budget, we initially thought we needed a special education teacher for a communications class that we ended up not needing to run. So, and there was 2 staff members that were not needed for that. So there is like variation based upon, even in staffing.
Can you say,
Sure.
Can you say something while we're on this slide
Sure.
about the dollar amount in relation to it as a percentage of our budget, and what the comptroller's office recommends, and how to think about that number? Because wasn't there something at one point, like a 4%, like they recommended only 4%?
Well,
even?
that's, okay, so our total unassigned, so reserves, again, are unique to districts and based upon needs of the district at that time. And, you know, and I understand, I'm not gonna question every, there's times in which there could be an opinion based upon what the current thinking is at that time, and I think you have to, you know, I'm sure, because I know in the on-board, there's a lot of things that come out, and quite frankly, now the controller, in the last few years, since post-pandemic, is actually encouraging districts to hold on to money, you know, so thinking changes, right? The way that we're rated by the rating agencies in terms of our lending has changed their philosophy. They want to see districts have a lot more in reserves, you know, in terms of what creates our bond rating, that change. So there's different things. That being said, I think the rule of thumb, you know, typically, or I think would be, you're going to have unique factors to each district that may be different from district to district. So I think I would never look at another district's, unless I knew the full background, and say, oh, well, why does, you know, such and such have, you know, 5 million in tax, or like, you know, because I may not know, like, they may have some, like, significant liabilities or businesses that may have closed or something that is, even if they're a relatively small district, right? Like, you couldn't automatically just assume, like, I'm just using Elmsford, and I'm not saying they have 5 million, but as a much smaller district than Hastings with less than 1,000 students enrolled, they may have a tax because of where they have a lot of, you know, SAMs, all these things that they could potentially need to have with a very small budget, a much larger tax rate. So I think it's unique to the district. There's times that, you know, including our district has been, you know, kind of, you know, based on an analysis at that time, there could have been, say, there's some of these you need to, I think you always should be mindful of reserves. All boards, everyone should be, and including myself. I'm not saying it should be this like, oh, just, you know, people should sock money away. But I do think at times some districts' philosophy has been, you know, we rather be a little bit more, and I've seen this response about saying it was ours and other districts where even when they have been more recently, like, well, you know, they have a little bit more in this reserve than we think is necessary. They're like, well, we feel more comfortable because, like, if something were to happen, like, who's going to pay for it? And I think, you know, depending on the district, you have to be comfortable with, do you have enough, do you have too much, and when is it going to go away? And I think that's to Jeremy's point, but I think as we look at our liabilities each year, we need to identify, like, the liabilities we have, and we should always be responsible if we have those, and we have monies available to try to reserve for those. But yeah, it's different. It's a difficult.
It's not a one, you know,
Yeah.
a quick number. One thing again before we leave this slide, that's, you know, I believe the first 9 lines sum up to become our total restricted number.
Yes. Yep.
So our first 9 is this big, you know, 7.4 million. Anything above 0, we're lucky to have. As Bill said, in Connecticut, it's tougher to find it. As Maureen said, you know, some of that is our staff's probable retirement payouts, and some of it is what we expect to use, you know, in our budget. The next line, I think, might be what, Doug, you were...
Is the 4%, yeah.
What you were speaking a little bit towards.
Yeah, we've
This
never had more
$2
than 4.
million that we have that's not one of those 9, does that feel like about where a district should be, knowing that at any time you could have the movie theater pull out, the movie production pull out, and a home of 100, you know, families come on in, and you need to get some modules all over the place to create some fabulous classrooms, those modules. You know, I mean, is that 2 million, you know, helpful if the tax centauri came in at 50% instead of 40%? You know, and if instead of looking at that 11 million total fund balance, because $1 million of it's gone as soon as we budget, you know, it goes from 11 right down to 10 once we use that 950. And it goes from 10 right down to 9 once you realize that that's, you know, that's Jeremy's unused vacation days, and either he uses it and you hire a sub to take his spot, or he doesn't use it and you pay him. You know, of that 9, you know, 2 million of it is very special to a district's ability to be reactionary.
That's
Whether it's a failed first budget, coming out of COVID, when you have so much uncertainty, you go, look, we can manage this, you know, we can, so does that 2 million feel like the right amount to a bunch of, first-term board members and, third-term
statutory
board
Talking about
members?
the- You're talking about the unassigned, it's
The-
at 4%. Yeah, we're not allowed to go above 4%. in
That
one.
one's a hard
That's a
cap.
It's a hard
four.
cap, and if
So-
you,
Now, there are, I just want to say, it's a required to be at 4%, and
To be
most
below
districts, 4 or below, it
Yeah.
could be up to 4. There are districts, I'm not suggesting this, that they get the credit, they actually get the write-up and they keep it above 4. I know, I never knew that districts
take the
actually
ding,
did that,
right?
they take the ding. There's some local districts that keep 6 and 7%.
But that's where we're at. 2 million
we
on a
keep 4.
$50 million budget is right at 4%. So we have
Yeah.
at the maximum in that category.
Which most people do.
And,
Yeah. I looked at this
good
last year.
districts do.
Yeah.
Not all Yonkers
I
doesn't.
bet you they have more than you think.
Yonkers is short 30 million every year. You know, it's the opposite. So in that sense, I think that number is a real nice one to keep your eye on. And if you go back 6 years, you see it was at 2 million. We got through COVID and still kept it at 2 million.
'Cause we got
The
like
state
3 million.
comptroller, I think, shares Maureen's philosophy of, you want me to write a report? I'm gonna write it pessimistic. You know, hey, guys, welcome, here's an extra $1 million. Don't plan on it. But yeah, you're getting it for a couple years, you know. There's a
Oh, yeah.
lot of good stuff in this budget. I said it last meeting, Bill and Maureen, I think, early on, you asked the board, what sort of budget do you think your community's ready to support? And I think coming in at 4% is on the low end of what you heard from this board for what they thought the community's ready to support. And I think we all know that 80% of our budget goes to staff, employees, and teachers, and that our staff and our employees and teachers get an average raise in that 4% range. There's very little flexibility. And in that sense, I really appreciate the time you took on this fund balances. You're bringing a lot of us up to speed in easy to understand, verbiage. And that 2 million is a really nice unassigned fund balance. You know, I'm not here, didn't run up for the board so that, I can decide capital projects. Should we build out the girls' locker room from the 1.8, or should we save it for when the roof gets surprisingly, they tell you,
Good right now.
Roofs are good.
I know,
Right.
but that was one before, like they went up there. Right, the cornice hasn't fallen off yet, and instead, no, we are ahead of the game. So, thank you for the reserves, thank you for the decades of reserve planning. And Bill and Maureen and Melissa and department heads, thanks for bringing us a budget in the 4% range. And I think next week the board will have a short meeting because there's not a lot of talking about when you tell your administrators come in the 4 to 5 to 6, 4 to 5 I think was what maybe you heard more often, and you come in, you have things go our way. You have state funding go our way, federal funding go our way. We're not optimists. We're reasonable pessimists with a smile. It's not a guarantee that 5 years from now we don't have a lot of pressure, but this year seems to be less pressure. So thank you very much for this slide, for this presentation, and for the work this year.
I would agree. Just, to put it simply, you put us on a glide path that makes sense for a lot of other moving pieces, and it's much appreciated because it's been, just the background of the past couple of years. It's pretty remarkable. I'm looking at I have a spreadsheet of all the local numbers, and we're really, I'm not going to go into it, but we really compare well, and that's a great testament to the work that's been done by everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, and I always say this just because I think, each year every district has unique things. This year, although we are at 4, it's considering the moving parts, and there were things in which we, again, if you remember our budget presentation, there were areas in which we did have savings, and some of it we anticipated because some of it was due to retirement, some of it was due to students aging out of our system, but we also did, part of that 4% this year is also, some of our additional debt that was coming on. So that also contributed to about 1%. Like, so the $18 million bond, that the majority of the debt came on last year. We did have the remainder of that debt also coming onto this budget this year. So we were fortunate, and I say that because I think sometimes districts, it's not, even if they're higher, just maybe they have a unique set of factors that they're dealing with, like a significant amount of, I appreciate the compliment, but I'm always very much want to make sure that, like all other districts, I know it's hard sometimes to be on the other side of those numbers when you have unique factors such as large debt payments or unexpected expenses coming on that may make your budget sometimes go a bit higher. But I think, as you said, I think in looking around and with the, certainly all districts like ourselves are dealing with increases in our utility costs and some things that we're all experiencing significant growth in. So that's been like challenging, I think, and you're seeing that reflected in the numbers that you're seeing reported across the county.
Any other questions or?
I mean, do we feel we need to go through the rest? I mean, I'm pretty clear on the transportation thing.
We could put up a slide and just ask if there's any board member questions on each slide, because it's been
Okay.
prepared for us.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
And then,
We had,
and give the, all the board
Oh,
a
I-
chance to look at
oh,
a
sorry.
slide without.
the next one that was sort of the reserves outlook, is that what you had?
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
sure.
yeah,
Why
Yeah.
is this not showing on the screen? I see it in my,
yeah. I see it too.
I see it in my,
Well, it's very green.
no, I know, but
Green is
it's
good.
funny because it's in the, in what we're looking for.
Yeah, slide
I have it.
19.
I don't
It's-
have it.
Slide
Bill-
19.
Bill's on that, I think he's doing something.
Yeah,
I don't- I'm on the one
It's the
online.
outlook,
It
it's
doesn't
the
even have it.
forward looking.
Oh, good.
No, it's funny. I don't know if that's the, know why? Because maybe Patrick doesn't, who loaded that one? It may not be the most updated. Let me,
Oh, okay.
The one online doesn't even have a slide that says reserves outlook.
Right here, you don't have this one?
Oh.
But we can talk about it,
so again,
No, I don't have
this is
it. I
again,
don't have it.
something
The one
that,
Melissa sent, just,
I'm at the one on board docs.
Do you want
Oh,
to see it, Maureen?
she emailed
in
us.
my
oh
copy?
no, I can see it, I meant on here. I actually have it on my screen. I think because I shared the presentation earlier, maybe that one, that slide,
Oh,
however
well-
it's being presented
well,
isn't in it.
I think it looks great. The reserves outlook has,
Nothing, no money.
possible, tax centori is gonna go down as predicted and planned for.
right.
And the capital projects at 1.8 is expected to be spent
Yeah.
over the next 5 years, which is why you have reserves. Maureen, is there anything concerning?
And similarly, like the liability reserve, and I'll just flag that, oh, you say Maureen?
We're at
Oh,
10.
sorry.
We're planning on spending some of our reserves on our tax liability and our capital.
Yeah.
We'll be at 7 in a conservative planning in 4 years from now.
Right.
That seemed fun. Is there any other slides that
Uh,
come up, or is 19 the last one?
No, it's, we have just the definitions, which I think are there for, so that on the, when we put this up on our,
The 2024
yeah,
will
so,
probably,
let me
the end
just,
of 2024
yes,
will go up, though. because
yeah.
We'll be moving appropriated.
Yeah.
balance.
So the other, I had the outlook, I have just the general definitions, we have the 5-year plan expenses and 5-year revenues, which again is, to Jeremy's earlier point, when the board's saying, fine, this is why we do look at this each year, and this is always part of our website, it's part, I
Right.
report out on this as always part of our budget process, and again, it's based upon not having all of the things, but it's really just taking a snapshot of your current budget, estimated end of year, your projected budget, and then saying, based upon those numbers, and again, where I can and where it's appropriate, like putting in where we think, okay, we may have some retirements this year or that year, and then really saying, but based upon, budget growth that we know we have in salaries each year, we have budget growth on actuals, and budget growth on employee benefits and all the other costs we have, where would that put us? And we can just like a 24-25 based upon this model. So this is pretty much saying, if most things considered would not change much, it's kind of looking at a current, staffing model with, and again, special ed is in different, I don't really want to say special ed, it could be that, or other things sometimes are a little bit more difficult to predict with exactly like, so I just typically take that number and just grow it. I don't tweak that too much. But you can see very quickly in 24, 25, because we have our current proposed budget at that 57 million number, you know, what does that look like as we blow it out for 24, 25, just based upon budget growth? As we know, is in that 4 to 5% number on actual salaries each year, it, you know, is about a net of that. You know, it looks different for each employee, but that's the type of budget kind of growth we see typically year over year. And just looking at the 24, 25, and again, there's high, medium, low, and just to quickly explain that, I mean, it's pretty obvious. It means that, you know, if everyone was kind of at top salary, and there's a little bit of variation to kind of show that, you know, typically I'll just say, like, let's, you know, focus on the median. We could focus on the high. I mean, I'm fine with either. I think low is pretty much never going to happen, so I'd rather just focus on the middle too. But based upon kind of our spending this year, and the only thing when we look at 24, 25 that I can kind of flag that is a lower number is that interfund transfer number, which is, you know, at about $600,000 this year, which is the capital and the special ed transfer. That's how they get combined as a reporting line. We're, you know, that we're showing in 24, 25 that number dropping back down. And again, this is just for to kind of get a general sense of where the budget may be. I mean, there may be a need to budget more money there the following year. But you can kind of quickly see that in each year without anything really being increased significantly or anything being added, anything new, any additional thing that people may want, like we did this year, we would be facing about at least a 3% growth factor next year in our budget to budget. And that's would be with kind of nothing needing to be extra or out of the ordinarily increasing. Even with our facilities costs, like that's assuming that the utilities won't continue to increase and things like that. But it is, you know, easy to see kind of like, even if we look at that, and now I just want to focus on the 24, 25 year just really quickly. And then as we look at the revenues, and this is kind of, you know, some of the discussion we had earlier, you can see, you know, pretty quickly in 24, 25, based upon what the allowable, we're anticipating just a flat 2% increase in the levy because we don't know if we'll have a growth factor for our property tax cap. So under the legal limit, we would be able to raise another $933,000 in taxes. And then we're assuming some increase in our state aid. Some of that is based on expenditure-based aid, so that's not foundation aid increases. That's based upon some of our building aid that we're also getting additional building aid in those future years in. So, but just looking at that, so next year, based upon very preliminary information, it would suggest, with as long as we're seeing increases in the other areas I flagged in revenues, with not an override, we could probably balance our budget. It is assuming still a use of fund balance, step down. It's really almost a flat use of fund balance. And again, this is just for illustration purposes, and obviously we can discuss these models and say, well, if we were to take it out, I think if we were to, as an example, in 24, 25, say, well, we don't want to use any appropriated fund balance, or we can't, or whatever the case may be, then we would have a $200,000 shortfall in revenues over expenditures in this model. So I think that's why, you know, the careful step down or consideration of fund balance needs to be considered, and/or if we cannot do so, or we may not have it, then that's where you have to kind of start looking at the expenditure side of the budget. But you can see pretty quickly as
it says revenue shortfall. That's not. I mean, that's why we had the slide right before it.
Yeah.
We're raising.
Right.
We're raising revenue.
Let's
I
go
mean,
with one-
each year matches up perfectly. Like 26.7 at 61 million. That's what you think the 2% tax cap would get us to.
Right.
We don't actually. This isn't showing actual a pothole in the future.
No, it is.
That is showing a.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason I say the first year, because I'm not going to say this is for $100,000, we'll figure it out.
Someone said they can't hear you.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure there's many
They
people
gotta start over.
don't want to hear me. Okay. So why would we not be concerned with the last three lines there?
Well, no, 25, 26, that's when we start, if again, and this is saying no breakage, like everything just keeps moving forward and being more expensive with, like, you know, this again, is why, and we do look at this each year, and sometimes even for me, and then what actually happens. So this is just saying, okay, all expenses moving forward, like there'll never be, you know, we're not gonna get much breakage from retirements, you know, things are gonna remain the same in terms of like maybe other expenses that were currently, you know, a little bit higher, but to your point, I think in most districts, models would look similar. I don't think there would be anybody that would say, oh, like, there'll never be any type of budget gaps, because with the restriction of the tax cap limit at 2% of a,
Okay.
you know, it always
So
is
could I
gonna-
look at that
yeah.
medium number there?
Sure, of course.
Medium for 25, 26
Oh, we're looking at the revenues, right? Okay,
has us at needing to go $900,000
Yeah.
above the 2% tax cap.
correct.
Which, one way to view that is, that's another 4% increase is what you're asking the community to support. This year, they were able to support 4% because some of it was in the bond, you know, but I think it's clear that, you know, moving forward, our community supported a 4% growth in a couple budgets. So would this slide be saying, hey, you know, this community isn't on a plan for 2% budget growth? And what you're calling a shortfall would be a pressured vote, but if historically you're looking to support 4% budgets, we can't just suddenly snap and pull it back
Well, I
2
think
years
that's-
from now?
Well, it's primarily because of the growth factor, right?
Yeah, so if we look at the expenses side again, we're seeing, like, let's just focus on the medium. We're, again, just
You
with
want to get to 61 million in 25,
Right,
26.
right, so that would be, like, right now, it would suggest that looking at, you know, current staffing, current expenses, and, you know, trying to be reasonable in what the growth is. You know, we know our debt service will be flat
Could
at
you
least.
toggle back and forth?
Sure, of
'Cause
course.
the medium number for 25, 26,
900 grand.
so
Yeah.
that's where it is. You're
Yeah.
saying we're going to be at 61 on expenditures,
sorry.
and we're going to be at 60 in revenue.
Yeah,
And this is with the state already going from 6.5 to 7.5 to 8.5 million from the state. Okay, and I think that's what a lot of people on this board believe, and that's not our biggest concern, that, you know, we don't have a tax cap, we have a tax rule, that 2%
Yeah, you can go
budget
above
growth
it, you know.
needs 51% of the community, and 4% budget growth needs 60% of the community.
Correct.
And our 2 votes last year can give differing opinions on whether or not you think 78% of the community is ready to support 4% growth or not. But I think this year in this budget timeline, I think these are helpful to put out and to put as transparent and public, but I think it doesn't affect the decisions we're ready to support for next week. Would you have any concerns with that sort of summary, or is that
no, I
seem
think
accurate?
that's fair, but I think just as we do internally, you know, it's a really important thing to kind of always keep looking at, because again, not to say that, you know, then of course we'll have our next year 23, 24, and then we'll see how we actually did, and then that will be then regenerate our
Rebase
projections
it.
out again, right? And it
And
could be,
one obvious number that's not in there is the possible $500,000 one-time expense
right,
for year
I'm
2,
assuming that's, yeah, dropping down.
But can I just point
hoping
out,
that it's dropping. Thank
Yeah.
you.
but that's also a reason why, you know, you're right. I mean, this is a concern, but that's a reason why the community, you know, a good reason for them to support things like what's going on at the Graham School. You know, that's where the growth becomes so important. It's really fascinating when you look at what the tax base was in this village in the 50s and 60s, when you had Anaconda and Zinser, and, you know.
Let's bring them back.
No, right, exactly.
No, Maureen says no, don't bring them back.
Let's invest in PCBs. But the number I remember seeing was, I don't know if it was Zinser plus Anaconda or just Anaconda alone, but it was almost 30% of the school budget was paid by that. And that really, you know, I think if you had a community where the businesses went away nowadays, there would be a whole bunch of state action to help support the community, which is what's happening up in Buchanan with the closing of Indian Point. But at that point, I don't think there was any support from the state. You know, Anaconda closed, Zinser closed, and, you know, the budget's kind of had a hole in it ever since, you know. But that's why these things, we have limited growth opportunities, but that's why this opportunity that's currently being considered is a really good fit for this very reason, so.
Are there any concerns that you're hearing about it? I mean, I know it's not our, venue at all. Village trustees, the 5 of them, and the village meeting, it seems like that's,
Yeah, no, I
it's 2
haven't,
years out, 4 years out, and it's a small, are there any concerns that it's going the other way, back to?
no, I think they've done a very good job of the way they've set it up. It's been very prudent, it's been very safeguarded. I think it fits with how people like things. Development's always a challenge, but I think that they've done it in a very, set up in a very thoughtful way. So no, I think it's a great opportunity. I mean, there's,
Well, I think these 5-year projections are always helpful. I think 3% budget growth will be a challenge, which is what we're showing here. We're showing sub 3.5% budget growth for the next 4 years, which seems to be a challenge when I know our salaries go up more than that.
Yeah.
But, and
no, I
even
would
with these numbers, we still are predicting in the very near future, community support for our schools, for our class sizes, for our many programs, and I think that's next year's problem. I don't think that's, not problem, that's a bad word. That's next year's discussions, and we can try to get on top of that with an informed community and an informed board again. I think these slides are very helpful again. Thank you, Maureen.
thank you.
And it's not a perfect science because, again, there's so much, that goes into the budget process, but it kind of does demonstrate where we know our historical 80% of our growth, we have a trend of what that percentage is year over year. So I think plotting revenues, salaries and benefits does show you like very quickly how kind of those are start to, not align.
Maureen, if I could,
Sure, of course.
just because the late hour, the transportation one, we kind of went over it. I forget who was here, but they'll be posted.
Yeah, no, I have it in the slide deck, so I think, unless there's any, this was the detail that
We talked a
was
little bit
provided.
about at the end of last,
Yeah.
yeah.
We had it in the pieces of paper.
Finance.
From the finance meeting, we just didn't have it in the formal deck.
Okay.
So I did include that in here, and again, this is based on this year's transportation expense breakdown. And even, these numbers are always tweaking a bit here and there, meaning if there's an additional student, believe it or not, it's still added, sometimes that does happen late in the year, but that is our current breakdown.
Alex,
of-
I think that's a hot topic for next year.
Okay. I hear you.
Any year where you're worried about a tax cap, that could be it. Let's end it with those words. yeah.
All right.
That are
Thank
up
you.
there.
Thank you. All right, do we need to close the meeting, or how does it work in work
You have to
session?
close it.
Thank you,
Okay.
I don't
Melissa.
think you have
Thank
to
you,
officially
Maureen.
close it.
Thank you,
You don't have
Melissa.
to officially close it.
Thank
No?
you.
We didn't call it to order, so.
That's true.
Bill.
Because it's a work session.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you all
Patrick,
very
thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks,
Thanks, Patrick.